Hello, I'm Laurie Johnson. Welcome to Houston Public Media's new web series, Political Perspectives. Every week, I'll be joined by show commentators Jay Iyer and Brandon Rottinghouse to discuss all things political. This week, we'll continue the conversation from Red, White, and Blue about the discussion with three of the mayoral candidates. So let's get started. I wanted to talk a little bit about just kind of how they performed, kind of what first impressions of seeing them maybe in a little bit more casual setting, not so much of a debate format.
Well, I thought all three of them were outstanding. I think from a substance perspective, from a style perspective, sort of command of issues, it was probably one of the better performances, particularly I think of Adrian Garcia. I think he started the process with some of the debates and had not done very well. I think the consensus from a lot of folks was whether or not there was some question as to whether he was kind of ready to take on that next role as being mayor. I think his arc and his evolution in terms of being a presenter in these formats, in terms of both detail and substance, I think has been remarkable. Stephen Costello has always been a very good, I think, detail-oriented speaker. He was, I think, a little more engaging, a little clearer today. And Chris Bell is he has a great background as a journalist and as a lawyer, and has been on the stage before, and as was great. But I think Garcia really, I think, surprised me just as an observer for how much better he has been now than he was from where he started.
Yeah, it's too bad we can't run them all together as kind of one big super mayor, right? Like have them stack on top of each other in one big floppy coat, right? I thought they all did great. And this is the kind of city debate that we should be having, because it really shows each of them in their best light. They can have a rational, reasonable conversation about some very, very important issues that face the city. I think that Bell is a good visionary candidate. That's his selling point. I think that Costello is a great detail-oriented policy person. And I think that Garcia is a great sort of hands-on, understands the problems, and is willing to kind of pull his sleeves up and make it happen. So they all present something very different to voters. Right. There's not a bad choice here, but I think that voters are going to have to make choices about which they like better, but they're all bringing something different to the table and all something good.
And they also seem to really kind of get along. Right. There wasn't that debate, jabbing at each other. It was just a conversation. They were even supporting and backing each other on some of the things they said.
Yeah, there was a real collegial quality. I mean, these guys have spent a lot of time together. I think there's something on the order of 60 plus debates there. They've been at numerous forums together, and in some cases they can finish each other's sentences and stump speeches. But I think they really, the format lended itself to it as well. I mean, I think that's an important thing. And they were able to get into details that you just don't normally get into.
So what were some of the details that stood out that maybe you hadn't heard or that you thought just came across really well, some of the specifics?
Yeah. I think two P's are important here. First is police and the other is pension. So on police issues, this is what the city is concerned about. You've got problems of not having enough officers on the ground, cases going unsolved, the clearance rates for some of these crimes pretty low. So this is a big issue going forward. The problem is how to pay for it, and that's connected to the pension issue, right? And that is, how are we going to solve this coming pension crisis? And they've each presented different opportunities and options for how that works. Steve Costello has said if we can get local control, then we can be able to refinance some of that and be able to provide for some additional monies. Chris Bell has said some similar things, but also has some organizational designs that might change it. And Garcia has had some options too. And so there are all these things kind of pulled together in one big bucket, but those are the two big issues I think that they all have to think about and that the next mayor is going to be working on front and center day one.
Right, sticking with the P term there, I mean personnel, right? When Stephen Costello brought up the point, 75% of the city's budget is personnel costs. So when we're talking about sort of cutting the budget and drawing it down, we're really talking about getting rid of people to some extent, or at least adjusting the current compensation system on pensions, and that was a big part. And finishing up on the P's, we talked about pot. We talked about cite and release, right? That was another thing, and that's another point that I think they were in agreement. Chris Bell has sort of been out there on this issue as far as suggesting that we write tickets and not arrest, and I think it's interesting that all of the major candidates have backed that position.
Well, it's interesting. We were talking a little while ago about how 30 years ago or 40 years ago, people were sentenced to 25, 30 years in jail for marijuana possession. And now we're talking about giving them a ticket and sending them on their way. Here in Houston, which is, not necessarily, Texas is not known for its, favorable attitudes
Right.
toward
Yeah.
recreational drugs.
There's one thing the legislature has always been good at, and that is being very pragmatic when it's come to fiscal issues. And the city faces a very important fiscal issue with respect to the jail. The jails are overcrowded. That's costing us money per day, $72 per day per inmate, and that adds up very quickly. So deferring some of those costs ends up being much more profitable for the city. They can reprioritize that money, and the county can use that money for other things like road, C or P, and add to P, an additional P, and that's pavement, right? We've got to have safe roads. We've got to have clear roads. We've got to have the ability to fill in potholes where necessary. So this is another issue where all these options are in a big bucket together, and how you take one part out leaves money for the rest, and that's a big question that they're going to have to face.
So I thought one thing that Steve Costello said was interesting. He said that he could see in 20 or 30 years the city becoming an entirely fee-based city,
Right.
that we would be paying for our garbage pickup, paying a public safety fee for police and fire. Is that the direction that cities are going to have to go to keep up with costs?
Well, that's a direction that a lot of cities are going. Most major cities in the country have a garbage fee already. We don't. We're one of the few states, one of the few municipalities that continue to fund it through our property taxes. But we have a revenue cap. We have a hard cap that basically says we can't grow past a certain amount, factoring in inflation and population growth. So the ability to add more services becomes harder. Our park system, to a large extent, is pretty much driven by the nonprofit sector right now. The zoo and Memorial Park and Herman Park are nonprofit-driven entities. So adding more and more fee-based services might be a way to get things done, especially when it avoids the revenue cap. And that's the other part of it. So if you want to increase revenue into the city, and you can't increase taxes, well, you can increase fees. And that solves some of the revenue issues, and that's one of the reasons why I think candidates are more open to the idea of a fee system.
And to Jay's point, I think that it's important for voters to think about the connections between these things. Candidates, by nature, make promises. They make promises that often they can't keep. And so we need to be sure that the kind of promises they're making are things that can actually come true. So I think Chris Bell called out some of the other candidates in the race by saying that it would be all well and good to have an extra 1,500 police like the police chief wants, but where will the money come from? And I think that voters need to think about not only what the promise is, but also how to pay for the promise. And so some of the things that they talked about and that Jay mentioned, I think, play directly into this. Where is the money going to come from?
Right, those extra police officers amount to about $150 million a year extra each year going forward. And you add that to an already $125 million debt that the city has, that whoever the next mayor is going to inherit. You're looking at 250, 275 million before you really get going. So there's real issues.
So where does the money come from then? I mean, what does the next mayor do, whoever it is, when they get elected?
Well, if we had that answer, we'd be the ones running for mayor, not that. No, I'm kidding. What they essentially have to do is a couple of things. One, you're going to have to get more revenue into the city in some form or fashion. That means either more revenue that you can use to attach these services. So you're going to have to cut some of the budget. None of these candidates are going to want to go up there and say we have to cut the budget, but when you have $125 million that you've got to shave, because by law we have to have a balanced budget, we can't run a deficit, you're going to have to cut that. And so they're going to cut through, and that usually means you reduce certain services that you have. And as Stephen Costello pointed out, 75% of the city is personnel. And so you're going to have to cut some costs. Yeah. So that might mean reducing workforce through attrition. That may mean layoffs, but it's going to mean a reduction in some form.
But this is just going to keep happening year after year after year unless somebody takes the initiative to either raise taxes, implement new fees, or somehow, rejigger the pension plans. Otherwise, this is just going to be a recurring problem.
Yeah.
People aren't going to voluntarily start handing the city more money.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. Yeah, they'll happily, right? Just turn your wallet over and just do what you wish.
Take my money.
Yeah, take my credit card. I think that what needs to happen, in addition to what Jay mentions, is that we have to have capital P priorities. The next mayor is going to have to decide what the top issues they want to focus on will be, and then direct all of the city's revenue into these sort of issues. And I feel like the budget is big in part because it's a lot of things to a lot of people, and no one interest gets fully served. Everything is slightly funded or moderately, moving in that direction. And I think that what needs to happen is that they need to focus on the big issues that they really care about, that the city really needs to focus on, and then have that drive the way that the revenue is produced.
So next week, we're going to hear from the remaining candidates. What are you hoping you'll hear? What are you hoping you'll see that might be refreshing?
I think the same level of detail, the same level of candor about kind of ways to solve problems would be good. And maybe a little bit of that same kind of collegiality we saw would be nice, where they can get into details without sort of degenerating into some sort of political sniping that we see at some debates. But I think that would be the biggest thing. I'd love to see them talk about the revenue cap in more detail, what they're going to do on pensions, what they're going to do in terms of getting more law enforcement on the streets. And so all those basic priorities, I think, is what all Houstonians want. And so let's hope we get that.
There's a risk at this point in an election where people are likely to be much more sharp than they would otherwise be, and we see policy focus waning. That needs to be, I think, less in this next round than I think it otherwise would be. This was a great format. It provided 4 opportunities for them all to speak. It let them leave their 6-shooters at home and saddle those problems and save them for a different time. But this is a place for voters to be able to make good choices and to be able to decide which candidate's the best, and that requires time and some development. So hopefully we can get some of the personal issues aside and bring in some of the policy issues.
Okay, well, it was fun talking about the candidates with you. Thank you so much. We'll see you guys again next week. And thank you for joining us here on Political Perspectives. Remember to log on to HoustonPublicMedia.org/perspectives every Friday night at 8 p.m. following the 7:30 broadcast of Red, White, and Blue. Thanks so much for watching. We'll see you again next week.